Hi, welcome back to All Things Jira, and I'm here with another weird story that I found on the internet. Now, today's story is about Carl Tanzler. Carl Tanzler was born February 8th, 1877 in Dresden, Germany. Carl was always a little bit weird. He was always seen as eccentric or a little bizarre. He claimed to be a count. He claimed to be the relative of the owners of the von Kassel Castle in Germany. He claimed to have been visited by one of his ancestors, a countess, who showed him the face of a beautiful woman, a beautiful dark-haired woman that was supposed to be the love of his life. He started going by Count Karl von Kassel at that time. In 1920, he married Doris Schaefer. They had two children. In 1926, Carl left Germany and he traveled around to a couple different countries. I believe Cuba was one of them, and he ended up in Zephyr Hills, Florida. Now, his family, his wife Doris and his two children came and followed him to Zephyr Hills at some point. In the following year, in 1927, Carl left his family again in Zephyr Hills and he moved to Key West, Florida. He took a job at the U.S. Marine Hospital as either a radiotechnologist or a radiologist. I'm not sure. Reports said two different things. But he took a job at the hospital doing something in radiology. On April 22nd, 1930, a woman came into the hospital. Her name was Maria Elena De Hoyos, and she went by Elena. She was 21 years old. She was a Cuban American woman with dark hair, and she was very beautiful. Now, Carl saw this woman, and he said he just knew that she was the woman that his ancestors were telling him about. She was the woman of his dreams. She was supposed to be the love of his life. So immediately he was in love with her. He found out what she was in the hospital for. Once they diagnosed her with tuberculosis, he convinced her family to allow him to treat her. Now, remember, Carl was not a doctor. He was either a radiologist or a radiology technician. He wasn't a doctor that was able to treat tuberculosis, but he convinced her family that he could do that. So he convinced them to take her home, and he went with them, and he took drugs, elixirs, all types of tonics, and he put together this plan to help cure her tuberculosis because she was the love of his life. He stole things from the hospital. He stole all his medicine from the hospital. He stole x-ray equipment. He stole other electronic equipment, and he took it all to her home to cure her of tuberculosis. Elena was the daughter of a cigar maker, Francisco De Hoyos. So I'm not sure, they may not have had a lot of money. Maybe that was the reason they agreed to allow Carl to treat her. But it was just Elena, her father, her mother, and then Elena had two sisters as well. Now, while he was treating Elena, he continuously professed his love for Elena. He told her how much he was in love with her, how she was the love of his life, and she was going to be just the greatest love of his life. He would shower her with gifts. He would bring her jewelry and clothes, along with all the things he was stealing from the hospital. And he was trying to treat her because he needed her to be alive. She was the love of his life. Now, although he continued to profess his love for her, she never reciprocated those emotions. She never told him that she loved him. She never told him she wanted to be with him. She never said that he was the love of her life. It was just a one-sided relationship. Now, although he was bringing her all types of drugs and tonics and trying to find different experimental ways to treat her, Elena died on October 25th, 1931. Now, Carl Tanzler convinced her family to allow him to pay for the funeral. He even paid for a mausoleum to be constructed for Elena to rest in. Elena's body was placed into the mausoleum. Now, her family did not know this, but Carl was the only one that had a key to this mausoleum. And he would go visit her in the mausoleum every night. He would go sit with her, talk to her, sing songs to her, and he was convinced that her spirit was coming to him while he was in the mausoleum and asking him to take her out of there. She was in the mausoleum for 2 years. He was visiting her every night for 2 years. And one night he decided that he wasn't going to do it anymore. He got a toy wagon. He took Elena's body, put it in the wagon, and wheeled her back to some makeshift lab that he had. So in the lab, he started to reconstruct different parts of her body that had started to decompose because she had been in the mausoleum for 2 years. I'm not sure how embalming techniques were back then, but she was starting to decompose. It was also Key West, Florida, so it's very hot. And her body just couldn't hold up any longer. She was dead. So he started to reconstruct different parts of her body that started to decompose. He used piano wire to keep her bones together. He inserted glass eyes. He also used silk cloth, wax, and plaster to cover up the parts of her skin that had started to decompose. As her scalp started to decompose, he took the hair from her head and made a wig to put back on her after he reconstructed her scalp. He filled her chest and abdominal cavity with rags to keep the regular shape of her body. He pretty much reconstructed almost every part of her body as it started to fall apart. So eventually he took her back to his home. Now, in his home, he would play the piano for her. He would sing songs to her. He would continue to buy her presents. He bought her shoes, stockings, jewelry, perfume, and he actually kept her in his bed. Now, he kept her this way for 7 years. He continually reconstructed parts of her body, brought her things. He was known to be singing to her. And one night, a little boy saw him in his living room dancing around his living room with what the little boy thought was a doll. So rumors started to spread in the town that he was buying jewelry and gifts for someone. He was in love with someone. And then once the little boy saw him in his window dancing with this doll, they started to wonder if maybe it wasn't actually a doll. Maybe he had done something with the girl's body. Now that just shows you how bizarre he was, that that's where anyone's thought would go, was that he has his body in his house and he's dancing around with it. He also used disinfectants, oils, formaldehyde, and a couple other things to try to keep the smell down from the decomposing body. Her sister Florinda, Elena's sister Florinda. Now Florinda heard the rumors about Carl buying jewelry and about him dancing around with some type of life-size doll, and she went to his house to confront him. So when she got to his home, she busted in to confront him and saw that her sister was there. So she called the authorities. The authorities came and they eventually arrested Carl. Now, the arresting officers saw the body and they said that at that point, Elena was more of a doll than she was even a human body. He had done so much to her. He even inserted a vaginal tube into her vagina, and they assumed that this was going to be used to have intercourse with the body, but they never found any evidence that he actually did that. He was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. And there was a trial set up. Now, this was a big thing in the town. Everyone was talking about it. There were rumors everywhere about what Elena looked like, what he was doing with Elena. Just everyone was talking about it. But some of the women there actually thought that it was romantic. They actually thought he was an eccentric, romantic man, and they wanted someone to love them as much as Carl loved Elena. That's pitiful, but that's what they wanted. They really thought this was like a romantic gesture to steal this woman's body that was not in love with him from her mausoleum, from her rest, to take her to his home. People are crazy. During the trial, Carl confessed that he was also constructing some type of plane or ship, and he was going to use that to fly out into the stratosphere with Elena's body, and he was hoping that the radiation from space would penetrate her skin and bring her back to life. So Carl was he was strange, and he was obviously having some mental health issues, but yet they deemed that he was competent to stand trial, so he did. But eventually the charges were all dropped because the statute of limitations were up. Remember, Elena had died at this point 9 years before. He had stole her body 7 years ago and held her in his house. So statute of limitations had been up, so the case was dropped. You would think that they would take Elena's body and give it back to her family so her family could give her a proper burial. But that's not what they did. They took the body to a local funeral home, and instead of burying her, they put her on display. 6,800 people came to view her body. Basically, they just gawked at her. Everyone just wanted to take a look at what she looked like, what she had turned into. She was known in town as a very beautiful woman, and now they wanted to see what she turned into. So that's horrible. It had to be horrible for the family to have their loved one that has died, that they have been grieving all these years. Now she's on display because her body looks like a doll. She doesn't even look like herself anymore. Now, some funeral directors say he really did a good job at reconstructing her, but she's not Elena anymore. Now she's this doll that he's created. So after they had her on display and all these people are coming in and out of the town to take a look at Elena, they finally gave her body back to the family, and the family had her buried in Key West Cemetery, but she's in an unmarked grave. So they didn't want Carl to go back and try to get her, and they didn't want anyone else to try to dig her up, especially with 6,800 people coming just to view her body. They weren't sure if someone else was going to try what Carl did, so they buried her in an unmarked plot in Key West Cemetery. And Carl actually had the nerve to ask for the body back. Since the trial was over, statute of limitations were up, he was set free, he asked to have Elena's body back because still he thought she was the love of his life. In 1944, Carl moved closer to Zephyr Hills, Florida, where his family was, and his wife, Doris, she was still his wife, she actually took care of him into his old age. I couldn't have done it, but Doris decided that there was something wrong with Carl, and she took care of him as he got older. Now, when he died, he died in his home. I'm not sure what he died of, but when they went in this home to get him, he had made another life-size doll of Elena. He had made another life-size doll of Elena, and he had used a death mask that he made from her body. Now, a death mask is a mask that you make by putting a mold onto a dead body and molding their face. So he had done that with Elena. He kept the mask, and he used that mask to construct another life-size doll of her. So who knows what he was doing with the doll this time. There's also a rumor going around that the doll that they found in his home when he died was actually Elena's body, and that he had replaced her body with a doll to go in the grave and took her body with him to his home. So that was never substantiated. No one knows if that was true or not, but crazy. Anyway, that was the weird story of Carl Tanzler and Elena De Hoyos. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.